The year was 476 AD, and the Western world believed it had come to an end. In Italy, barbarian warriors stormed the palaces of Ravenna. The last Roman emperor, a frightened boy named Romulus Augustulus, was led away into obscurity. Chroniclers would write that Rome had fallen and that darkness now ruled the earth. Yet, as the smoke of the west rose into the sky, far to the east, a different dawn was rising over the waters of the Bosphorus. There stood Constantinople, the new Rome, its walls glistening with morning dew, its domes catching the first light of the sun. Merchants called out in Greek, Latin, and Syriac. Church bells mingled with the cries of sailors unloading ships from Alexandria and Antioch. The air smelled of salt and incense, fish and fresh bread. If you listened closely, you could almost hear the heartbeat of Rome still pulsing through those streets. For here, the empire had refused to die. Its officials still wore purple cloaks and spoke in the language of the Senate. Its laws, coins, and armies still bore the eagle. Even its citizens called themselves Romaioi, Romans, though their tongue was Greek and their faith now Christian. In the east, Rome had not ended. It had transformed, sliding like a river into a new bed of time. The city stood on a peninsula between two seas, its harbors curving like open arms to the world. It had been chosen a century earlier by Constantine the Great, who had walked its hills and declared, "This is where the center of the world shall be." He had named it after himself, as emperors did, but his vision was larger than ego. Constantine dreamed of a Rome reborn, not pagan, but Christian, not decaying, but eternal. And somehow, across the centuries, that dream had held. By the time the Western Empire collapsed, Constantinople was a fortress of order surrounded by chaos. To the north roamed Huns and Slavs. To the east lay Persia's armies. To the south, desert tribes and ancient empires. But behind its three rings of walls and its golden horn-shaped harbor, life flourished. Markets overflowed with spices from India, silks from China, amber from the Baltic. Scholars copied the texts of Plato and Homer, their ink the color of midnight. Priests argued about angels, while engineers built aqueducts that carried sweet water into the palace gardens. To live in Constantinople was to believe that the world still made sense, and that belief was the empire's truest armor. Outside its gates, Europe shuddered through its dark awakening. Kingdoms rose and fell like waves against rock, but the Byzantines watched with measured calm. They called the new rulers of the West simply the tribes, the Franks, the Goths, the Lombards, names that sounded to their ears like echoes of a world half asleep. While others forgot how to read, the Byzantines debated the nature of the Trinity. While others built huts from timber, they carved mosaics from glass and gold. They saw themselves not as a remnant of Rome, but as its continuation, its light refined through faith. And yet, beneath the splendor, there was fear. They knew the earth beneath them was shifting. Every generation heard the rumor that the city would one day fall, that the sea and the sky would turn against it. So they prayed harder, built higher, and wrote more beautifully, as if to bribe eternity with art. At night, when the lanterns were lit along the walls, the whole city glowed like a constellation fallen to earth. Travelers approaching from the sea spoke of the golden dome shining miles away, of the great cross above the palace catching the moonlight like a sword. Sailors called it the lamp of the world. And so it was. For 1,000 years after the West collapsed, Constantinople would burn like a candle in the darkness. sometimes flickering, never extinguished. But what kept that flame alive? Not only armies or walls, but faith. To the Byzantines, history was not a story of decline, it was a drama written by God. Every siege was a test, every victory a sign of favor. Their emperors were not merely rulers, they were chosen custodians of a sacred order. When they walked into the Hagia Sophia crowned in purple, the crowd saw in them the reflection of heaven on earth. In this theater of eternity, the Byzantine Empire played the longest role in human history, the empire that would not leave the stage. Still, every empire carries its own ghosts. Even as Constantinople thrived, its people felt haunted by Rome itself. They imagined the old Senate whispering from marble ruins, the legions marching in their dreams. They feared that one day their own names would be forgotten as surely as those of the Caesars. Perhaps that fear was what drove them. To build walls so strong they seemed immortal, to paint saints so radiant they outshone time itself. For centuries after the West fell, travelers came to Constantinople and wrote of its marvels. The columns brought from temples of Greece, the bronze horses that guarded its hippodrome, the palace so vast that it seemed to contain a city within a city. They called it the heart of the world, the mirror of heaven. They said that as long as Constantinople stood, the world could not end. And yet, the city's people knew that standing was not the same as peace. Barbarians pressed at their borders. Persia loomed to the east. Earthquakes and fires tested their resolve. But each time the walls cracked, they rebuilt. Each time plague came, they prayed and survived. The city seemed to draw strength from the very things that should have killed it. It was not merely stone and mortar, it was habit, memory, faith, made visible. If you had stood on its walls at sunset in those days, you would have seen the gold of the sky reflecting on the gold of the city, water and marble shimmering together. The Bosphorus below would have glittered with merchant ships, their sails tinted rose by the light. And above it all rose the cross of Christ and the imperial eagle, symbols of heaven and earth bound in one vision. That was the promise of Byzantium, that the divine and the human could coexist if only the flame was kept alive. The world outside called them Byzantines, but they never used the word. To themselves, they were Romans, keepers of the old order under a new light. Their empire was no impostor. It was Rome's living soul transformed. From this eastern city, laws would be written that governed Europe for 1,000 years. Icons would be painted that defined Christian art. And armies would ride to defend the faith long after the West forgot how to march. When foreigners asked how the empire had survived, its people answered simply, God willed it, and perhaps He did. For while the world beyond its walls slipped into forgetfulness, Constantinople remained a memory that refused to fade, a city of marble and mirrors, of logic and mysticism, of swords and psalms. It was the continuation of a dream that had begun on the banks of the Tiber and found its final home on the shores of the Bosphorus. And so, as 476 became 486, and 486 became 586, the world changed around it. New languages were born, new faiths spread, but the great city endured. Her walls held, her lamps burned, her people believed. In a dark age, she was a memory of light, a reminder that civilization is not easily undone. The Romans of the East did not call themselves survivors, they called themselves chosen. And from that conviction would rise the extraordinary story of emperors and saints, of scholars and warriors, of a city that stood for 1,000 years against time itself. Because Rome had not fallen, it had merely moved its throne eastward into the light of a new morning. History rarely moves gently. Sometimes it shifts beneath the feet of a single man. In the early 4th century, the world was fractured. The old Roman Empire, vast, magnificent, and exhausted, was tearing itself apart. Emperors rose and fell in quick succession, each claiming the favor of the gods, each leaving behind only blood and rumor. Provinces rebelled, borders cracked, and the grandeur of Rome seemed to be collapsing under the weight of its own glory. Yet amid this chaos, a soldier named Constantine, son of a provincial noble and a tavern maid named Helena, began his quiet ascent. He had the soldier's stoicism of the Danubian frontier and the politician's patience of Rome. But unlike his rivals, Constantine was haunted not by ambition alone, but by a vision, an invisible thread that would pull him toward destiny. The story begins on the eve of a battle that would decide the fate of the world, the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, 312 AD. The armies of Constantine faced those of Maxentius, a usurper who held Rome itself. The Tiber River gleamed under an autumn sun, reflecting thousands of shields. Before dawn, Constantine wandered through his camp alone. He had fought before, but never like this, never with the weight of history pressing against his chest. He looked to the west, where the mist lifted over the city he sought to claim. Rome, the eternal city, but it was no longer eternal. It was crumbling, its senate corrupt, its gods silent. And perhaps deep down, Constantine understood what few men dared to imagine, that Rome's salvation would not come from its temples, but from something unseen. That night, he saw a sign. Chroniclers tell us that in the darkening sky, he beheld a cross of light above the sun, and beneath it, the words in hoc signo vinces, "In this sign, you will conquer." Others say it came to him in a dream, a whisper from beyond. Whether vision or omen, it changed the course of his life. He ordered his soldiers to paint the symbol of Christ upon their shields, the Chi Rho, the intertwined Greek letters of the Messiah's name. The next day, his army marched beneath that sign, and when the battle came, Maxentius was swept into the Tiber, his armor dragging him down like the idols of the old world sinking beneath the tide. Constantine entered Rome as its master, but he did not thank Jupiter for his triumph. He thanked the God of the Christians. That moment would ignite the birth of a new age. In the years that followed, Constantine's faith deepened. His mother Helena, now Saint Helena, journeyed to the Holy Land to seek the relics of Christ's Passion. Constantine himself issued the Edict of Milan in 313, ending centuries of persecution and giving Christians the freedom to worship. Churches rose beside temples. The empire, once ruled by gods of thunder and war, now began to whisper prayers to a single creator. But Constantine's vision stretched beyond faith. It reached into the bones of empire itself. He saw that Rome was dying not because of enemies, but because of itself. Its senators clung to marble while its people starved. Its legions fought one another more than foreign foes. The old capital had become a museum of its own greatness. If Rome was to survive, it needed rebirth. It needed distance from corruption, from nostalgia, from the ghosts of Caesar. So Constantine looked east, toward the narrow strait where Europe touched Asia, where ships from every horizon crossed paths. There lay an ancient Greek colony called Byzantium, small, wealthy, and perfectly placed. Its harbor, the Golden Horn, could cradle 1,000 ships. Its hills rose in terraces toward the sky. It was, in every sense, the heart of the known world. In 324 AD, after uniting the empire under his rule, Constantine stood upon those hills and saw the city that would bear his name. "This," he said to his architects, "shall be my new Rome." From that moment, the transformation began. They built walls that glimmered white against the sea, aqueducts that carried water from miles away, palaces whose courtyards opened to the wind. Statues from every corner of the empire were brought here, of Alexander, of Apollo, of forgotten kings, to remind the new city that it inherited all time. The Hippodrome was rebuilt, greater than the Circus Maximus, where chariots would one day thunder between banners of blue and green. Constantine ordered craftsmen to fill the streets with marble columns and porphyry slabs. The Forum of Constantine rose at the center, crowned by a colossal column topped with its own likeness, wreathed not in laurel, but in a halo of 7 rays blending emperor and saint, Rome and heaven. But the soul of the city was its churches. At the heart of New Rome, Constantine built the Church of the Holy Apostles, designed as a resting place for his dynasty and for himself. He placed 12 empty sarcophagi around his own, one for each apostle, as if to suggest that he too was chosen. For this, his critics called him arrogant. His followers called him divine. But perhaps he was only human, longing to leave his life carved into eternity. The city grew quickly. Merchants came from Syria, Egypt, Armenia. Artists from Antioch covered walls in mosaic skies of gold and indigo. Priests debated heresies in shaded courtyards. Latin and Greek intermingled in the marketplaces. One could hear the sound of the world converging. When the dedication day came in 330 AD, the entire city glowed with oil lamps. The emperor rode through the streets in a chariot gilded with silver, offering sacrifices of incense rather than blood. At the city's gates, he raised a cross and declared, "In the name of the eternal God, this city shall be free of idolatry." Constantinople, the city of Constantine, was born. It was more than a capital, it was a statement, a bridge between continents, between pagan and Christian, between past and future. A city not of marble alone, but of meaning. And from that day forward, Rome's center of gravity shifted eastward. The Senate still met in the old city, but its influence faded. The emperors of the West became provincial shadows, while Constantinople gleamed with the confidence of a new order. For the next 11 centuries, its people would call themselves Romans, yet their Rome was of the mind and the spirit. They saw themselves as inheritors of Augustus's peace and Christ's kingdom at once. Their coins bore the faces of emperors, their hearts the symbols of saints. In the years that followed, Constantine's dream would face storms, theological wars, invasions, schisms. But it endured because it had been born from both faith and necessity. He had not built merely a refuge for an empire, but a stage for the next 1,000 years of civilization. There is something haunting about the thought that one man could change the direction of history by turning his gaze eastward. From the decaying palaces of Rome to the shining domes of Byzantium, Constantine's journey mirrored that of the empire itself, dying, yet determined to live again. When Constantine died in 337, he was baptized on his deathbed, his armor replaced with the white robes of a catechumen. He was buried in the church of the holy apostles beneath a canopy of gold. Those who stood watch swore that sunlight streamed through the windows in such a way that it crowned his body with radiance. The people called him equal of the apostles. Even his enemies admitted he had seen something others had not. The truth that power could be sanctified by purpose, that Rome could survive by faith when its legions could no longer hold the frontiers. After his death, poets wrote that his city would last until the end of time, and for centuries it nearly did. Ships entering the Bosphorus would see its walls glinting like white fire against the horizon. They would pass beneath towers crowned with crosses, past marble quays where merchants spoke in 10 languages. Pilgrims called it the earthly paradise. To them, it was proof that God's kingdom could have an address. Constantine's gamble had succeeded beyond imagination. What he built was not merely a capital, it was a civilization that would outlive its creator by 1,000 years. From its harbors would sail fleets of crusaders and explorers. From its schools would come theologians and philosophers whose words shaped East and West alike. And yet, there was irony in its perfection. By anchoring Rome's future to faith, Constantine had also planted the seeds of conflict between crown and church, between heaven and earth, between man's ambition and God's plan. The empire would spend centuries wrestling with those questions, never quite answering them, never ceasing to ask. But on that first spring morning of 330 A.D., as sunlight broke over his new city, Constantine must have believed he had done it. He had bound heaven to earth, faith to empire, eternity to time. Standing at the balcony of his palace overlooking the Marmara Sea, the emperor watched gulls drift above the water and heard the hum of life below, markets opening, prayers beginning, the rhythm of a city awakening. He whispered, "May this be the new Rome, eternal." And for more than 1,000 years, it was. Empires often find their truest mirror not in the splendor of peace, but in the turmoil that tests their soul. When Justinian the Harsh rose to the throne in the year 527, Constantinople was already a masterpiece, 1,000 years of marble and prayer, but beneath its beauty, fractures ran deep. The city glittered like gold leaf, hiding cracks in the stone. Its people were proud, restless, divided. Its streets rang with shouts of merchants, monks, and mobs who all believed they spoke for God. Into this world stepped Justinian, a man whose ambition was both sacred and dangerous. He dreamed of restoring the Roman Empire in its entirety, of rebuilding not just its walls, but its idea, the perfect union of law, faith, and order. To his critics, he was arrogant. To his followers, divinely chosen. To history, he would become both. He was born not in Constantinople's palaces, but in the rough hill country of Illyria. His uncle, Justinus, had risen from a peasant soldier to the purple throne, and through him, the young Justinian was brought to the capital. He arrived wide-eyed, hungry, devouring the city with his senses, the scent of incense from Hagia Sophia, the glint of coins in the market, the thunder of chariots in the hippodrome. To him, Constantinople was not just Rome's heir, it was God's workshop on earth. And yet, even emperors need more than vision. They need balance, heart, and courage. Justinian found all three in a woman no courtier could have predicted. Theodora, a former actress, daughter of a bear keeper from the city's circus, known to some as a sinner and to others as a saint. Their love story remains one of history's most unlikely alliances. Theodora was fierce, where Justinian was cerebral, instinctive, where he was idealistic. She had lived among the poor, spoken with those the empire ignored. Where Justinian saw policy, she saw people. When courtiers mocked her, she did not bow. She met their scorn with fire, and Justinian, recognizing the strength in her defiance, made her his empress, equal in title and soon in power. Together, they envisioned a world cleansed of decay. The empire had grown corrupt. Laws were tangled. Justice sold like merchandise. Justinian called for a reform of the entire legal code, a monumental task that few dared attempt. For years, scribes labored in lamplight to compile centuries of Roman decrees into one great body of order, the Corpus Juris Civilis, the foundation upon which much of modern law still stands. In its dry language lived a profound idea that empire was not merely force, but principle, that the law must outlast the sword. But while scholars worked in silence, the city outside was far less still. The people of Constantinople were divided into factions, known by the colors of their chariot teams, the blues and the greens, ostensibly sports clubs, but in truth, rival political armies. Their chants in the hippodrome carried the undertones of revolt. To walk those streets was to feel 1,000 tensions crackling like lightning above the marble. In January 532, the storm broke. It began, as so many disasters do, with pride and rumor. The factions accused imperial officials of corruption. The government responded with arrests. A day later, during a race at the hippodrome, the crowd began to chant, not the usual cheers, but a single word that would soon echo through history. Nika, conquer! What began as protest became inferno. The mob spilled into the streets, torches in hand, and the city ignited. Palaces burned, churches crumbled. For 5 days, Constantinople descended into chaos. The air thickened with smoke and screams. Whole quarters were flattened. The emperor, trapped in his palace, watched the sky turn red. Many urged him to flee. "Save yourself," they begged. "Sail to the provinces. Live to rule another day." He might have done so had Theodora not spoken. In that moment, she stepped into legend. She stood before the terrified court, her voice calm, her eyes unwavering. "My lords," she said, "the present is a time for deeds, not words. If flight were the only path, I would not choose it. For an emperor's robe makes the best burial shroud. Purple is a fine color for death." Silence followed. Then Justinian straightened, his fear burning away. He ordered his generals, Belisarius and Mundus, to surround the hippodrome, where the rebels had gathered. At his signal, the soldiers entered from both gates and sealed them shut. What followed was slaughter beyond reckoning. 30,000 died where they stood. The rebellion ended not with negotiation, but with fire and blood. When dawn came, smoke drifted over a city half destroyed. Justinian stood beside Theodora at the palace balcony, looking out upon the ruins, and there, amid the ash and ruin, he saw opportunity. "We will rebuild," he said, and rebuild he did. From the wreckage rose monuments that would redefine the empire's glory, none more so than Hagia Sophia, the great church, the crown of Constantinople. Justinian summoned 2 of the greatest architects of the age, Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus, and commanded them to create a temple unlike any the world had seen. When they asked what it should look like, he simply said, "As heaven touches earth." For 5 years, thousands of laborers worked from sunrise to moonrise. Marble came from the islands of the Aegean, porphyry from Egypt, green stone from Thessaly. Columns from ancient temples were repurposed as if the old gods themselves were being folded into the new faith. The sound of chisels and hammers became the heartbeat of the city. When the dome finally rose, shimmering under sunlight, the people wept. Inside, golden mosaics glittered like stars trapped in stone. The vast expanse seemed weightless, a vision of eternity frozen in architecture. On the day of its dedication in 537, Justinian entered in ceremonial robes and stood beneath the dome's luminous curve. Overcome with awe, he raised his hands and cried, "Solomon, I have surpassed thee." It was more than pride, it was the exhale of a man who had survived fire and rebellion to build heaven from ash. The years that followed seemed to justify his confidence. His general Belisarius reconquered North Africa, then Italy, raising the imperial banners once more over Carthage and Rome. For a brief, shimmering moment, the map looked whole again. The dream of reuniting the Roman world had returned, but dreams come at a cost. The wars drained the treasury, the rebuilding taxed the people. Famine followed bad harvests. Earthquakes shattered provinces. Then, in 541, a far deadlier enemy arrived. The plague of Justinian, the first great pandemic in recorded history. Ships from Egypt carried more than grain. They carried death. Within weeks, Constantinople was stricken. The streets emptied. Corpses filled the cisterns. Chroniclers wrote that at the height of the plague, 10,000 died each day. The stench drove men mad. Justinian himself fell ill, hovering for weeks between life and death. Theodora ruled in his stead, refusing to abandon the palace. "If he dies," she told her ministers, "then I shall die beside him." He survived, but something within him changed. The brilliance of his reign dimmed into melancholy. In those final years, the empire trembled under the weight of its own greatness. Wars, taxes, plague, all had taken their toll. But even as his body weakened, Justinian's mind remained aflame. He continued to legislate, to debate theology, to command the building of churches as though creation itself might hold decay at bay. When Theodora died in 548, he was inconsolable. Her tomb, veiled in silk, stood beside the Church of the Holy Apostles, where sunlight filtered through colored glass onto her name. The city mourned not just an empress, but a symbol, the woman who had stared down death and reshaped destiny. Justinian outlived her by 17 years. In that time, he became more myth than man, wandering the palace at night, murmuring prayers, his crown heavy with memory. When he died in 565, he was laid beside her, beneath the church they had both built and consecrated. The world he left behind was battered but luminous. His conquests would fade, his buildings would crack, his laws, though, would endure through millennia. Yet perhaps his greatest monument was the idea he embodied, that civilization, however wounded, could always rebuild. Hagia Sophia still stood, its dome catching the sunlight, its mosaics whispering glory into the centuries. Pilgrims entering its vastness said they felt their souls lift as though stepping briefly into eternity. That feeling, that fusion of faith, art, and order, was Byzantium itself. The empire would never again be as vast or as rich as under Justinian, but his vision had crystallized something essential. Byzantium's purpose was not conquest, it was continuity. It existed to remind the world that beauty and belief could coexist with suffering, that from ruin, perfection could be attempted, even if never achieved. Centuries later, when travelers from the West first saw Hagia Sophia, they said they did not know whether they were still on earth or had been lifted into heaven. That was Justinian's triumph, and Theodora's too. The dream of perfection, shimmering forever above imperfection. The age of Justinian had begun in triumph. It would end in silence. From the marble balconies of the palace, one could still see the sunlight burnishing the domes of Constantinople, still hear the chant of monks drifting from the courtyards, still smell the sea wind threading through the streets. But beneath that serene facade, something unseen had already entered the city, quiet, patient, and infinite. It began, as death often does, with whispers from the docks. Sailors spoke of fever in Egypt, of rats abandoning grain ships, of corpses floating down the Nile. The tales sounded distant, like fables carried by the tide. Constantinople had survived wars and earthquakes. What was one more rumor of pestilence? The market stayed open, the bells rang, the emperor worked late into the night, revising laws. The people believed the sea would protect them. But the sea is never loyal. It brings riches and ruin with equal grace. One spring morning in 541, a merchant galley from Pelusium unloaded its cargo of wheat along the harbor of Theodosius. The sacks were heavy and warm. Inside them, invisible stowaways stirred. By nightfall, the rats had scattered through the city, their fleas carrying the gift of oblivion. At first, it seemed an ordinary illness, fever, fatigue, swollen glands. The physicians called it bubon, after the Greek for groin, where the swellings rose like bruises of fire. By the end of the week, the hospitals overflowed. By the next, the graveyards could no longer take the dead. The air filled with the low moan of bells tolling for every parish at once. Then even the bells fell silent. There were not enough hands left to ring them. Constantinople, the city that had survived rebellion and war, was brought to its knees by breath and blood. Chroniclers would later try to count the dead, 5,000 a day, then 10, then numbers too vast to mean anything. They wrote of carts piled high with bodies, of priests collapsing mid-prayer, of ships drifting in the harbor, crewless and still. The wind carried the smell of decay across the Bosphorus. The gulls fled inland. Whole neighborhoods vanished into silence. Where chariots once thundered in the hippodrome, only the buzz of flies remained. And in the palace, the emperor himself fell ill. For weeks, Justinian lay delirious, burning with fever. The court whispered that God was taking back the crown he had lent. Outside the palace gates, the people wailed, not for love of him, but for fear of what his death would unleash. The empire had one mind, one architect. If he fell, the edifice might crumble. Through it all, Theodora did not leave his side. She slept in a chair beside the imperial bed, her face drawn but resolute. When courtiers begged her to flee the city for her safety, she answered, "If the empire dies, I will die where it lived." For 40 days, Justinian hovered between worlds. Then, impossibly, he opened his eyes. The fever had broken. He lived, but the empire around him was forever changed. When he rose from his sickbed and looked out upon his capital, he saw not the shining new Rome he had built, but a ghost of it. Fires had been lit to cleanse the air. Whole districts still smoldered. The aqueducts ran red with rust and blood. The streets were lined with ditches filled to the brim, ditches that had once been gardens. He could no longer hear the hum of the markets or the clang of hammers, only wind and the caw of crows. He walked the palace halls barefoot, the sound of his steps echoing where hundreds of servants once bustled. He passed murals depicting his victories, the reconquest of Carthage, of Rome, of Ravenna, and felt none of their glory. He whispered to himself, "All the world I reclaimed, and still it dies." The survivors spoke of visions, angels seen over the harbor, fiery swords hanging in the sky, voices in the wind reciting psalms of warning. Even the most rational men began to think the apocalypse had come. But time, relentless as tide, kept moving. When the plague finally retreated, it left behind not relief, but exhaustion. A thin layer of despair that coated everything. Those who lived became cautious, inward. Faith hardened into dogma. Beauty turned austere. The empire entered a long twilight of introspection. Justinian emerged from the shadow, older and stranger. He still ruled, still legislated, still dreamed, but his gaze turned increasingly toward heaven, as though he hoped to find there what the earth had denied him. He poured his energy into theology, convening councils to define the nature of Christ, to settle arguments that had already torn provinces apart. He wanted unity of belief as he had sought unity of territory. But belief is not mortar. It cannot bind what fear has fractured. And yet, even in decay, Byzantium did not stop creating. From the ashes of plague rose new mosaics, darker and more introspective than before. Artists began to paint saints not as triumphant figures, but as wounded, luminous beings, faces thin, eyes vast, gazing beyond suffering. The style we now call Byzantine was born from that transformation. Sorrow transmuted into serenity, terror into transcendence. The city slowly refilled. Children were born who did not remember the silence. Markets reopened, though smaller. Bells rang again, though fewer. Byzantium had learned to live with fragility. It became a civilization obsessed not with conquest, but with endurance. Still, fate was not finished. In 558, an earthquake shook the city. The great dome of Hagia Sophia, Justinian's masterpiece, cracked and collapsed. The emperor, now gray and weary, wept openly as he walked among the ruins. He ordered its rebuilding at once, saying, "If heaven falls, we shall raise it again." Within 5 years, the dome was restored, higher, lighter, almost floating. Perhaps no act better captures the empire's soul: to suffer destruction and respond with creation. Beyond the city, however, the world Justinian had tried to reunite was slipping away. His conquests in Italy and Africa drained the treasury. The western provinces rebelled again. In the east, Persia gathered strength. New enemies appeared from the steppes, nameless horsemen riding with the horizon at their backs. And over the southern deserts, a new faith was stirring, still unseen, still forming words that would one day reshape the earth. Theodora did not live to see these omens. Her death left Justinian solitary, almost spectral. He worked late into every night, dictating decrees, revising codes, arguing theology with bishops until dawn. The courtiers whispered that he slept only 2 hours a day, that he ate nothing but greens and honey, that he conversed with angels. Whether true or not, the empire began to take on his likeness, tireless, haunted, brilliant. When he finally died in 565, the news spread quietly, like the closing of a door. There were no riots, no triumphs, only weary reverence. He was buried beside Theodora in the Church of the Holy Apostles. As the sarcophagus was sealed, the last light of the candle shimmered on the mosaics of their faces, two mortals immortalized in gold, gazing at eternity together. But empires do not rest easily. After Justinian's death, the crown passed to rulers less certain, less visionary. Taxes rose, armies thinned. Plague returned in smaller waves. The cities survived each, but the optimism of the early century never returned. Byzantium entered what historians would later call its age of testing. To its people, it felt like living within a perpetual Lent, a season of repentance stretched across generations. They prayed for the strength not to rise, but to remain. And perhaps that was the lesson the century had come to teach, that survival is itself a form of faith. For though fire consumed their streets and pestilence hollowed their homes, the Byzantines refused despair. They filled the emptiness with song. Each Easter after the plague, the processions grew longer. The people carried candles through the avenues chanting, Christos anesti, Christ is risen. The words echoed off the stones where death had once ruled, as if the city itself were answering, truly he is risen. It was not triumph they celebrated, but endurance, the miracle that life, fragile and trembling, had chosen to stay. From those years of loss, Byzantium emerged tempered, introspective, almost philosophical. Its theology deepened, its art matured, its politics grew more cautious. The empire that once sought to recreate Rome had become something different, something smaller but more enduring. It understood impermanence. It had looked directly into the face of mortality and learned to build beauty that acknowledged it. The world beyond still saw wealth and ceremony, purple robes, jeweled crowns, processions of candlelight. But within, the empire's spirit had changed. It was now an empire of memory, of what had been and what must never be forgotten. Later, generations would look back on Justinian's time as both golden and terrible. They would see in it the pattern of all Byzantium's centuries to come, creation paired with catastrophe, glory shadowed by grief. In every church dome, they would sense the weight of the one that had fallen and been raised again. In every hymn, they would hear the echo of prayers once spoken over a dying city. And so, when historians speak of the Byzantine soul, they mean this paradox, the serenity that hides sorrow, the faith that survives its own disappointment. It was born in those years when plague turned Constantinople into a charnel house, and yet, somehow, the bells rang again. The fire had passed, but its light remained, a quieter light now, less the blaze of triumph, more the steady flame of endurance. From it would come the empire's next stages, of monks who painted icons with trembling hands, of emperors who ruled more by prayer than by sword, of scholars who preserved the wisdom of worlds already vanished. For Byzantium had learned that perfection was fleeting, but perseverance was divine. It would never again reach the splendor of Justinian's day, but it would also never surrender to despair. Through plague and fire, it had discovered its truest strength, not immortality, but resurrection. The centuries after Justinian were an age of storms, not only of armies and earthquakes, but of the spirit. The empire had survived plague and fire, yet within its heart another fire now burned. The question of what God truly looked like, and whether he could be looked upon at all. For Byzantium, faith was not an ornament. It was the glue that held the world together. Every law, every battle, every coronation echoed through the cathedral's arches. emperors ruled by the grace of God, and their people believed it. But when that same faith turned inward, when heaven itself became a matter of debate, the empire trembled. It began quietly with painters and pilgrims. In the monasteries of Cappadocia and Mount Sinai, monks painted icons, holy images of Christ, the Virgin, and the saints, meant not merely as decoration, but as windows into eternity. The faithful prayed before them, kissed them, carried them into battle. The icons became companions, mediators between earth and heaven. To destroy one was to wound something sacred, but to the emperors of the 8th century, images seemed dangerous. They feared idolatry. They feared rebellion more. When invaders threatened the borders and earthquakes shook the capital, some asked whether God was punishing them for venerating paint and wood. The Emperor Leo III, a soldier hardened by war, decided to act. In 726, he ordered the removal of the great icon of Christ from the chalky gate of the palace. Soldiers climbed the ladder and tore it down. The crowd below screamed. Women threw stones. Guards drew swords. Blood stained the marble. The first icon had fallen, and with it, peace. What followed was a century of spiritual civil war, the era of iconoclasm, the breaking of images. It was a battle not fought on foreign fields, but in the soul of Byzantium itself. Monks hid their icons in caves, painted in secret by candlelight. Imperial soldiers stormed monasteries, burning frescoes and scraping mosaics from walls. Brothers fought brothers. Bishops defied emperors. Whole provinces revolted. The air smelled of smoke and incense together. The two scents of Byzantium's faith and fear entwined. The emperors claimed they were purifying the church. The monks said they were desecrating it. Each side quoted scripture. Each prayed for victory. In the process, the empire's unity, spiritual, cultural, and even military, splintered, and beyond its borders, enemies waited. To the east, the Arab Caliphate expanded with astonishing speed. From Damascus and Baghdad, Muslim armies swept across the Levant and Egypt, lands that had been Byzantine for centuries. They came not only with swords, but with conviction. There is no God but God. The empire that had once seen itself as Christendom's fortress now faced a rival civilization, younger, hungrier, and certain of its faith. The new religion challenged Byzantium not just with armies, but with simplicity. Islam forbade images of the divine, seeing God as beyond form or face. To many Byzantine emperors struggling to explain their own wars and plagues, this stark monotheism seemed a rebuke. Iconoclasm was, in some way, their answer, a theological armor forged in imitation of their enemies' clarity. But in trying to make faith pure, they risked making it hollow. Within the walls of Constantinople, the struggle turned the city into a battleground of silence. Mosaics were plastered over, icons removed. Hagia Sophia, once blazing with gold saints, stood bare, its dome echoing only with chants. Priests whispered forbidden prayers behind closed doors. Mothers taught their children to cross themselves before hidden paintings buried beneath the floorboards. Faith went underground, and from there it became unbreakable. Then came Empress Irene, a woman of Athens, widow of Leo's son. She ruled first as regent for her child, then as empress in her own right. Where her predecessors had shattered, she sought to restore. In 787, she called a council in the city of Nicaea, the same where Constantine's bishops had once declared the nature of Christ. Now they debated the nature of his image. The council ruled that icons were not idols, but instruments of veneration, that to honor them was to honor the God they represented. When the decree reached Constantinople, bells rang again. Hidden icons were brought back into the light. Painters returned to their scaffolds. Saints reappeared upon the walls. It felt, for a moment, like resurrection. Yet Byzantium's peace never lasted long. Within decades, a new generation of emperors would reverse Irene's decree, reigniting the persecution. Only in 843, under another woman, Empress Theodora, namesake of the great Theodora of Justinian's age, was the veneration of icons finally restored forever. On that Sunday, still celebrated as the triumph of orthodoxy, the people filled Hagia Sophia, carrying their icons high. The light of morning struck the gold faces, and for the first time in a century, heaven seemed to smile. But the scars remained. Iconoclasm had done what no foreign army could. It had taught Byzantium to mistrust itself. The empire that once spoke with one voice now whispered in many tongues. Faith, once uniting crown and church, had become an argument that would never entirely fade. And while it argued, the world outside moved on. By the 9th century, the empire's borders had shrunk. Asia Minor bled from constant raids. Sicily and Crete fell to Arab fleets. The Balkans stirred with new peoples. The Slavs and the Bulgars, whose loyalties were yet uncertain. To survive, Byzantium turned from the sword to the soul. If it could not conquer new lands, it would convert them. So began one of its quietest, greatest victories. 2 monks from Thessalonica, Cyril and Methodius, set out northward, carrying not weapons, but words. They translated the Bible into the language of the Slavs, creating an alphabet that would one day give birth to Russian, Serbian, Bulgarian. They baptized kings, crowned them with Byzantine blessings, and carried the empire's faith into forests where Rome's legions had never marched. In doing so, they ensured that even as Byzantium's power waned, its spirit would expand, eastward into the heart of future nations. But every light casts a shadow. As Byzantium spread its faith, the Western Church, the heirs of old Rome, watched uneasily. The bishops of Rome and Constantinople, once brothers in Christ, now eyed each other as rivals. Their quarrels over doctrine, over authority, over a single line in the creed, whether the Holy Spirit came from the Father alone or from the Father and the Son, grew sharper. These were not petty disputes. They were the cracks through which the unity of Christendom began to bleed. Meanwhile, new enemies pressed harder at the frontiers. The Bulgars in the north, fierce and proud, adopted Christianity, but never submission. They built their own empire, their own patriarchate, mirroring Constantinople in miniature. To the east, the Abbasid caliphs sent raids deep into Anatolia, their banners glittering against the sun. On the western seas, Arab corsairs struck the islands, burning and vanishing like shadows on water. Yet, through it all, the city still stood, the great, immovable heart. Behind its triple walls, the Byzantines watched empires rise and fall like waves. Their faith, once fractured, had hardened into something serene and intricate, a jewel polished by conflict. By the 10th century, the empire was smaller, but wiser. Hagia Sophia once again shone with mosaics of Christ Pantocrator, Christ the Almighty, staring down from the dome with calm omnipotence. The people who prayed beneath that gaze had lived through heresy, fire, and fear. They no longer believed the empire would last forever. They believed instead that it must be made worthy while it lasted. In that shift lay Byzantium's transformation from imperial Rome to spiritual fortress. Its soldiers might be fewer, its borders narrow, but its faith had become iron. The emperor now ruled not only as Caesar, but as priest-king, protector of orthodoxy, defender of the one true image. The empire's wars were fought not just for land, but for souls. And so, when Basil the Bulgar slayer would later march to war, or when missionaries would ride north to Kiev and Moscow, they did so with that conviction that Byzantium was more than a state. It was the keeper of heaven's order on earth. This belief would sustain it for centuries, and in the end, it would destroy it too. For when faith and empire become indistinguishable, doubt becomes treason, and every defeat feels like divine judgment. But in the 8th and 9th centuries, that synthesis gave the empire a second life. The fires of iconoclasm had burned away illusion, leaving a faith both fierce and luminous. From now on, Byzantium would see itself not as one empire among many, but as the last bastion of truth in a world of error. It was a dangerous conviction, and an extraordinary one. From the bare walls of the iconoclast churches, the painters returned, covering them once again in saints and seraphim. From the ashes of theological war, the hymns rose sweeter than before, and when pilgrims entered Hagia Sophia, they felt the story of Byzantium written in its stones: rebellion, ruin, renewal. Outside, the world shifted, new powers grew, yet within those walls the gold still glowed, and the faithful still whispered before the icons, "Lord, remember your city?" And perhaps he did. For even as armies approached, as schisms deepened and centuries turned, Constantinople endured. Its faith tested, its soul scarred, but its flame unextinguished. It had survived the plague, survived the fire, survived its own doubt. Now it would face the sword once more, led by emperors of steel and prayer who believed, against reason and history, that they guarded the last light of Rome. They called him Basil the Cairn, and history would remember him by another name, the Bulgar Slayer. Yet beneath that grim title lay something deeper. The last great emperor forged entirely of iron, the embodiment of Byzantium's endurance, turned to will. When Basil came to the throne in 976, the empire was weary. 2 centuries of internal strife and theological wars had left it proud but brittle. The palaces gleamed, the mosaics shone, but the frontiers bled. Enemies pressed from every side, the Fatimid Caliphate to the south, the Abbasids to the east, the Bulgars from the north. The treasury was empty, the army restless, and within the city itself the crown was a prize for which families schemed like vultures circling the same carcass. The powerful aristocratic clans, Phocas, Skleros, and others, had grown rich from the endless wars, ruling their provinces as small kingdoms of their own. They despised the young emperor, who at 18 looked more monk than monarch. They mistook his silence for weakness. They would learn their mistake too late. Basil was no orator, no visionary like Justinian, no philosopher king. He spoke little, trusted few, and smiled rarely. His faith was private, his patience endless, his temper glacial. He rose before dawn to train with his soldiers and rode at their side through rain and dust. He ate what they ate, slept where they slept. He kept no mistress, no luxury, no laughter. He seemed carved from the same stone as the empire itself, unyielding, austere, and built to outlast. At first, the great generals rebelled. Bardas Skleros in the east, Spartas Phocas in the west. Each proclaimed himself emperor. Civil war flared like wildfire across Anatolia. For years, the empire devoured itself. The throne hung by a thread, and many whispered that Byzantium had finally reached the end of its long miracle. But Basil waited. He learned. He watched his enemies exhaust themselves. When the time came, he struck not with passion, but precision. The rebellions were crushed, the traitors blinded or sent into monasteries to pray for forgiveness they would never feel. The emperor's authority was absolute again. And now he turned north, to Bulgaria, the old and bitter foe. The Bulgarian Empire under Tsar Samuel was no mere frontier nuisance. It had grown powerful, stretching across the Balkans, raiding deep into Greece, even threatening the walls of Thessalonica. For the first time in generations, Byzantium faced an enemy that mirrored its discipline and matched its faith. Samuel was fierce, cunning, and devout, ruling from the mountain fortress of Ohrid. He dreamed of humbling the empire that had once baptized his ancestors, of turning its riches into his crown. To Basil, this was not merely war. It was punishment for centuries of weakness, a reckoning written in God's ledger. He swore he would not rest until Bulgaria bowed. The campaign would last 30 years, the longest single struggle in Byzantine history. It was not a war of heroes, but of endurance. Winter marches through frozen passes, sieges that starved whole valleys, battles fought knee-deep in snow and mud. Basil never flinched. He was relentless, methodical, pitiless. When cities resisted, he broke their walls. When they surrendered, he taxed them, but spared their people. He rewarded loyalty, crushed betrayal. Slowly, like a glacier grinding down a mountain, he wore Bulgaria to dust. In the year 1014, the final confrontation came at the Battle of Clydion, a narrow pass in the Macedonian hills. Samuel's army had fortified the valley with wooden palisades, confident that Basil could not break through. The emperor studied the terrain, then sent a detachment under his general Nikephoros Xiphias to scale the mountains and fall upon the enemy from behind. At dawn, as the Bulgars braced for frontal assault, Byzantine horns blared from their rear. Panic rippled through the ranks. The trap snapped shut. Thousands were cut down where they stood. The rest fled into the passes, only to be captured by the advancing legions. When the battle ended, Basil surveyed the field, a carpet of bodies, the smell of iron and smoke heavy in the air. He ordered the surviving 15,000 prisoners blinded, leaving one man in every 100 with a single eye to lead the rest home. When the mutilated army stumbled back to Ohrid, Tsar Samuel saw them coming and, overcome by grief, collapsed and died. The story spread like wildfire across Europe. The Iron Emperor, who had blinded an entire nation. From that day, he was Bulgaroktonos, the Bulgar slayer. To his enemies, he was a monster. To his people, a savior. To history, a paradox. The man who brought peace through terror, who forged unity through pain. After the victory, the Balkans were annexed. The empire stretched once more from the Danube to the Euphrates, its borders the widest since Justinian's time. But Basil did not celebrate. There were no triumphal parades, no feasts, no speeches. He rode back to Constantinople quietly, entered Hagia Sophia, and knelt alone before the altar. Witnesses said he prayed for the souls of the men he had blinded. Perhaps he knew that victory, too, has its ghosts. Under Basil's rule, the empire became a machine of discipline. Corruption was crushed, taxes collected with precision. He rewrote the land laws to protect peasants from the greed of aristocrats, earning the love of commoners and the hatred of nobles. He personally inspected the provinces, disguising himself to learn the truth of his officials. He even commanded that the roads be maintained for soldiers, not merchants. For peace is a harvest that grows from war, he said. His reforms rebuilt Byzantium's strength. Gold filled the treasury. Granaries overflowed. Fortresses rose on every frontier. Diplomats from the Holy Roman Empire and the Caliphate came to court, dazzled and wary. The emperor's word carried the weight of inevitability, yet beneath the surface his reign was cold. No children, no joy, no softness. He lived like a monk on a throne, eating boiled vegetables and sleeping on a wooden cot. His only pleasure was the perfection of order. To his courtiers he was distant, to his soldiers divine. They said his eyes saw everything and forgave nothing. He was the empire personified, immortal in ambition, human in loneliness. In his later years, Basil waged one last campaign in the east against the Georgians and Armenians, securing the mountain passes and ensuring that the empire's eastern wall would hold. He returned to Constantinople exhausted, his body failing, but his will unbroken. On December 15, 1025, after nearly 50 years on the throne, the Iron Emperor died quietly in his sleep. When the news reached the barracks, soldiers wept openly. When it reached the palaces, nobles sighed in secret relief. Byzantium had lost its last ruler who feared nothing, not man, not hunger, not time. He was buried not in the church of the holy apostles among the emperors, but outside the city walls, in the cemetery of the soldiers. His tomb bore a simple inscription: "From my youth I have labored in wars and perils for the safety of the Romans. Lord, grant rest to thy servant in the place of the living." For a century after his death, that grave became a pilgrimage site for soldiers departing for war. They would touch the stone and whisper, "Basil, walk with us." The age that followed him was one of peace, prosperous, golden, deceptively calm. The fields bloomed, the markets thrived, the scholars wrote. Constantinople glowed again, its palaces reflected in the silver waters of the Golden Horn. Travelers from the West called it the wonder of the world. But within that peace lay the beginning of decline. Basil had ruled through fear and force. Without him, the discipline decayed. The great families crept back into power. Corruption seeped into the courts. Generals grew lazy, soldiers soft. Within decades, the empire that Basil had hammered into steel began to bend once more. Still, his legacy endured. His wars had reshaped the map. His laws strengthened the state. His legend fortified the Byzantine spirit. Long after his empire began to crumble, his name was invoked by emperors who dreamed of his iron certainty and by peasants who longed for his stern justice. Even the enemies he crushed remembered him with awe. Among the Bulgars, mothers whispered to their children, "Sleep, or Basil will come for you." But in that fear lingered respect, the recognition of a man who had embodied destiny itself. Historians would later say that with Basil's death, the medieval world reached its final perfection before beginning its long descent. For Byzantium, his reign was the summit, the last moment when the empire of Constantine and Justinian, scarred but unbroken, still held dominion over half the known world. After him came intrigue, decline, and the long shadow of foreign powers. But for one lifetime, the empire had again felt infinite. If you walk today among the ruins of Ohrid, where the blinded soldiers once passed, or stand beside the stones of Constantinople's forgotten walls, you might still feel his presence, the echo of boots on gravel, the cold resolve of a man who saw the empire not as inheritance, but as burden. Basil the Sion, the Iron Emperor, the last light before the dusk. When Basil the Sion died, he left behind an empire at its height, wealthy, fortified, serene. For a brief moment, it seemed the old dream of Constantine had finally been fulfilled. The frontiers held firm, the seas were safe, and the Golden Horn shimmered like liquid gold beneath the morning sun. Constantinople looked eternal, but eternity is a fragile illusion. It cracks not with thunder, but with the soft whisper of complacency. After Basil's death in 1025, a string of emperors inherited the throne, men of comfort rather than conquest. They presided over banquets, not battlefields. The armies that had once followed Basil through the snows of the Balkans were left to decay in forgotten garrisons. The great treasury he had filled with silver and grain was drained to fund luxuries and palaces. Within a generation, the empire's armor had turned to silk. Meanwhile, far beyond the eastern mountains, a new force was rising. Nomads of the steppe, fierce and disciplined, driven by faith and destiny. The Seljuk Turks, followers of Islam, began sweeping westward, carving their own empire from Persia to Armenia. In 1071, at the Battle of Manzikert, they met the Byzantines in open war. The Byzantine army, fractured by politics and arrogance, faced disaster. Emperor Romanos IV of Diogenes, brave but ill-supported, was betrayed by his own generals. The battle collapsed into chaos. Thousands were slain or captured. The emperor himself was taken prisoner. When news reached Constantinople, it was as if the sun had dimmed. Anatolia, the heartland that had fed and defended the empire for centuries, was lost almost overnight. Fortresses fell, villages emptied, monasteries burned. Refugees poured into the capital with nothing but their faith. The empire that had once ruled the Mediterranean now clung to its walls like a shipwrecked survivor to driftwood. In its desperation, Byzantium turned west to the Latin kingdoms of Europe. The emperor Alexios I Komnenos, a man of cunning and courage, saw that the empire could not reclaim its lands alone. He sent envoys to the Pope in Rome with an extraordinary plea: "Help us, and we will help you." He did not realize he had just invited a storm. The message reached the ears of Pope Urban II, who saw in it an opportunity not merely to aid Byzantium, but to unite Christendom, and perhaps to reclaim the Holy Land. In 1095, he stood before a crowd at Clermont in France and cried, "Deus vult!" God wills it. The words ignited Europe like a spark in dry grass. Knights, peasants, kings, and thieves alike took up the cross. They sold their lands, left their families, and marched eastward, believing they were chosen by heaven. They came not as mercenaries, but as pilgrims with swords. And behind their prayers lay hunger, for land, for gold, for redemption. When the first waves of crusaders reached Constantinople, the city had never seen anything like them. Tens of thousands camped outside the walls, armored men from France and Germany, barefoot zealots from the countryside, women and children trailing behind. They sang hymns and stole chickens in the same breath. Emperor Alexios rode out to meet them, cloaked in gold, the city's towers gleaming behind him. He looked upon these ragged warriors and saw not saviors, but chaos waiting to happen. He fed them, guided them, and hurried them across the Bosphorus as quickly as possible. The Crusaders swore fealty to him, promising to return any lands they conquered that had once belonged to the empire. They did not keep their word. When they captured Antioch, they kept it for themselves. When they took Jerusalem in 1099, they drowned its streets in blood. The tales that reached Constantinople were horrifying. Thousands slaughtered, mosques and synagogues burned, the city bathed in red. Alexios watched in silence. Byzantium had called for aid and received apocalypse instead. Yet for a time, an uneasy peace held. Trade resumed. Diplomacy patched what faith had torn. The Crusader states in Syria and Palestine served as buffers against Islam, but the empire's wounds were deep. Every new emperor inherited less power, less loyalty, less trust. By the 12th century, Constantinople had become both a wonder and a warning, the richest city on earth, but surrounded by enemies and envious allies. Its streets overflowed with silks, spices, and suspicion. The market sold everything from Egyptian perfume to Russian furs. Pilgrims wandered through Hagia Sophia, awestruck by its golden dome. And yet, beneath the incense and music, there was tension. The Byzantines saw themselves as the true Romans, heirs of 1,000 years of civilization. The Latins, those rough knights from the west, they called Franks, barbarians with crosses. The Latins, for their part, saw the Greeks as decadent and deceitful, too proud to be proper Christians. The wound of the great schism of 1054, when the Eastern and Western churches excommunicated each other, had never healed. Each side called the other heretic, and hatred, once named holy, becomes unstoppable. The fourth generation of Crusaders would bring not salvation, but ruin. In the year 1204, a fleet of Venetian ships sailed toward Constantinople. The Fourth Crusade had been called to reclaim Jerusalem once more, but debts and politics had twisted its course. The Venetians, led by the blind and ruthless Doge Enrico Dandolo, persuaded the Crusaders to attack the richest city in Christendom instead of the Holy Land. They told them it was just, that the Greeks were traitors, that they had defied Rome, and greed did the rest. As dawn broke over the Bosphorus, the people of Constantinople looked out from their walls and saw sails filling the horizon. The Crusaders came singing hymns, their banners bearing the cross. But the cross had turned against them. For 3 days the city held, its walls still magnificent, its defenders brave but few. Then, through a gate left unguarded, the Latins broke in. What followed was not war. It was desecration. They looted the palaces, melted the icons, tore jewels from altars. The bronze horses of the hippodrome were ripped from their plinths and shipped to Venice, where they stand to this day. Monks were slaughtered at the altar, nuns violated, libraries burned. One chronicler wrote that the flames rose higher than the dome of Hagia Sophia, and that the sky itself seemed to mourn. Inside the cathedral, the Crusaders erected their camp. They placed prostitutes on the patriarch's throne and drank wine from sacred chalices. A soldier, half drunk, tore a page from a gospel to light his torch. The empire of Constantine, the light of 1,000 years, was extinguished by the hands of those who called themselves its brothers. When the smoke cleared, the Latin Empire of Constantinople was proclaimed. The Crusader leaders divided the city's treasures like spoils of a pagan conquest. Enrico Dandolo, the Venetian Doge, ordered the empire's archives shipped west. a millennium of history scattered to the winds. The Byzantines who survived fled into exile. Princes, monks, and scholars carried what they could: manuscripts, relics, memory. They founded small successor states: Nicaea, Trebizond, Epirus. These fragments flickered like candles against the darkness. For 57 years, the Latin conquerors ruled the once golden city. They tried to govern, but they did not understand what they had broken. The wealth they plundered vanished, the art they could not sell, they destroyed. Constantinople's streets, once lined with marble and music, became empty and afraid. But Byzantium was stubborn. It refused to die quietly. In 1261, the exiled emperor Michael VIII Palaiologos launched a daring assault from Nicaea. His troops entered the city through a forgotten postern gate, while the Latin garrison slept. When the morning came, the purple banners of Byzantium once more flew above the walls. The people wept as they watched the emperor ride through the ruined gates. But their tears were not of triumph. The city he reclaimed was a corpse, burned, plundered, hollow. The Hagia Sophia's gold was stripped, its mosaics dim beneath soot. Palaces lay in ruin. The empire that had once ruled from Spain to Syria was now a city-state surrounded by enemies. Michael VIII wept when he saw it. "I have taken back the body," he said, "but the soul has fled." Yet he rebuilt what he could. The churches reopened, trade returned, scholars set their pens to parchment again. For 2 centuries more, Byzantium would limp onward, proud, haunted, and beautiful. It would become less an empire than an idea, a whisper of what had been, a light trembling in the wind. But the Fourth Crusade had done what no Muslim army ever could. It had broken the heart of Christendom. The Latins and the Greeks would never trust each other again. The West had killed its elder brother, and in doing so, sealed both their fates. For when the next great power came from the east, from the plains of Anatolia, there would be no unity left to stop it. Still, in the ruins of Hagia Sophia, when the candles were lit for vespers, the light danced on the cracked mosaics, and the faithful whispered the same prayer they had whispered for 1,000 years. "Lord, remember your city." And somewhere in the unseen depths of time, perhaps he did. For though the walls had been breached and the treasures carried away, the spirit of Byzantium still lingered, quiet, defiant, unbroken, waiting for the dawn that would never quite come. The Crusaders had won, but history had already begun to forget them. The city endured, and in its endurance lay a kind of victory, the endurance of memory, the resilience of faith, the stubbornness of beauty itself. In the end, Constantinople did what it had always done. It survived. When the smoke cleared from the ruins of Constantinople in 1204, the city that had once been the heart of the world lay silent. The mosaics of Hagia Sophia were blackened, the palaces looted, the relics of saints carried away in wagons bound for Venice and Rome. For the first time in 900 years, there was no Roman emperor in the Queen of Cities. The great chain that had guarded the Golden Horn for centuries hung broken, swaying in the tide like a necklace torn from a corpse. And yet the spirit of Byzantium did not die. It scattered. As the Latin conquerors divided their spoils, fragments of the old empire slipped through their fingers like sand. Princes, scholars, monks, and soldiers fled in every direction, east, west, north, carrying with them what they could: books, icons, coins, faith. The empire that had once ruled from the deserts of Syria to the forests of the Danube now existed only in exile. Splintered into shards of memory and defiance, three of those shards would shine brightest: Nicaea, Trebizond, and Epirus. Across the Bosphorus, in the fertile valleys of western Anatolia, the Laskarid dynasty established its capital at Nicaea, the ancient city where emperors had once defined the creed of Christianity. It was a fitting refuge, a city of councils, not crowns, of words instead of walls. There, under Emperor Theodore the Fern Lascaris, Byzantium's intellectual flame was kept alive. In Nicaea's small but vibrant court, scribes began to copy the manuscripts saved from Constantinople's libraries. Theologians debated by candlelight using ink made from the ashes of the burned capital. The emperor himself slept in a modest chamber, ate from clay dishes, and wore a crown, beaten from salvaged gold. "We are poor," he said, "but we are still Romans." His successor, John III, Ducas Vatatzes, ruled with quiet brilliance. He reformed the army, rebuilt trade, and won the hearts of his people by feeding the poor from his own estates. He dreamed not of vengeance, but of restoration, a slow, patient resurrection of the empire's body. Under his rule, Nicaea became a refuge for artists and monks fleeing Latin occupation. They painted again the icons that had been stolen or desecrated, their hands trembling with devotion. The faces of Christ and the Virgin reappeared on walls once blank with grief. "If the city of God is lost," one monk wrote, "then let us build it anew in our hearts." Through decades of war and diplomacy, Nicaea endured. It was Byzantium in miniature, smaller, poorer, but unbroken in spirit. Farther east, beyond the Pontic Mountains and the whispering Black Sea, another fragment glittered: Trebizond, ruled by the Komnenoi, descendants of the old imperial line. Hidden between sea and forest, Trebizond became a jewel of exile, a city of merchants, mystics, and mariners. Its walls rose from cliffs, its harbors filled with ships trading furs, silk, and honey. The Komnenoi called themselves emperors of the Romans, though their dominion was barely more than a coastal thread. Still, they maintained the rituals of empire: purple robes, golden coins, and processions through the streets on feast days. In the echo of those ceremonies, one could still feel the pulse of Constantinople's lost grandeur. Trebizond became a sanctuary of art and memory. Monasteries clung to its mountain slopes like swallows' nests. In their chapels, frescoes bloomed again, the blues and reds of heaven reborn in paint. Travelers from Armenia and Persia called it the city of eternal dawn. To them, Trebizond was not a remnant of Byzantium, but its dream, preserved beyond the reach of time. To the west, amid the rugged mountains of Greece, another fragment survived: the despotate of Epirus. Ruled by ambitious nobles and exiled generals, it was a land of warriors and intrigue. Its leaders dreamed not merely of survival, but of reclaiming Constantinople itself. They built castles on cliffs and filled them with refugees: monks from Mount Athos, scholars from Athens, peasants from the islands. Epirus was raw and fierce, less an empire than a rebellion that refused to end. For decades, the Epirate despots clashed with the rulers of Nicaea, each claiming to be the true heir of Byzantium. But behind their rivalry lay a shared conviction that the empire must return. For nearly 60 years, Byzantium existed as memory and map. Children born in Nicaea grew up hearing tales of the lost capital, how its domes once shone like the sun, how its market smelled of cinnamon and sea, how its bells could be heard across the Bosphorus on still mornings. To them, Constantinople was less a city than a prayer whispered before sleep. Meanwhile, the Latin occupiers within those walls began to wither. The Latin Empire of Constantinople was a poor imitation of what they had conquered. The Crusader nobles quarreled, their soldiers deserted, their coffers emptied. The Venetians took the ports, the Franks the palaces, but neither could command the people. The Greeks who remained inside the city called themselves ghosts among strangers. One chronicler wrote, "They took the crown, but not the soul." By the mid-13th century, the time for return had come. In 1259, Michael VIII Palaiologos, co-emperor of Nicaea, seized power after years of intrigue. He was cunning, educated, and utterly ruthless, qualities that Byzantium, at this stage of its life, required more than virtue. He strengthened his armies, forged alliances, and waited for the right moment to strike. That moment arrived 2 years later. In July 1261, while the Latin garrison of Constantinople was away on campaign, a small Byzantine detachment under Alexios Strategopoulos crept through the countryside near the city. Locals told them that the walls were lightly guarded. Strategopoulos took the gamble. Under cover of night, his men approached the gate of the spring, a small postern long thought forgotten. They slipped inside, scaling the inner walls. When dawn broke, they opened the main gates and let the army in. By the time the Latin knights realized what had happened, it was too late. The city was theirs again. When Michael Faith entered Constantinople weeks later, he dismounted and walked barefoot through the gates. Witnesses said he wept openly, his tears cutting tracks through the dust on his face. But when he reached Hagia Sophia, the sight struck him silent. The cathedral was stripped bare, its altars looted, its mosaics defaced, its marble pitted with sword cuts. The great dome still stood, but the light within it seemed dimmer, hesitant. The emperor fell to his knees and whispered, "I have found her body, but not her soul." It was true. The Byzantine Empire had returned, but it was an empire in name only. The population of Constantinople had dwindled from hundreds of thousands to perhaps 50,000. The harbors were empty, the markets silent. The surrounding countryside lay in ruin, divided among Latin and Turkish warlords. The treasury was bare. The empire that once ruled a third of the known world now controlled little more than Greece and a sliver of Asia Minor. But it was alive, and in Byzantium that had always been enough. Michael Thwaite, for all his cruelty, understood the power of appearance. If the empire could no longer command armies, it would command imagination. He poured what resources he had into restoring the city's churches and libraries. Scholars were summoned from exile, artists given patronage, theologians encouraged to write. Slowly, Constantinople began to glow again, not with the fire of empire, but with the light of intellect. Mosaics were repaired, not to their old perfection, but with a new, softer style. Figures elongated, faces thoughtful, colors subdued. The art of Byzantium had grown introspective, almost melancholy. Every saint seemed to know his world was fading. Yet within that fading came a strange beauty, the Palaiologan Renaissance, a last flowering of Byzantine culture that would later influence the Italian Renaissance to come. In the quiet courtyards of monasteries, monks copied Aristotle and Plato, blending classical philosophy with Christian mysticism. Mathematicians studied the stars. Theologians debated the union of soul and body. Even as their empire shrank, their minds expanded. The Byzantine court became less imperial and more monastic. The emperors walked among philosophers and artists rather than generals. They argued over theology while the Ottomans gathered strength on the horizon. It was as if Byzantium, knowing its end was near, turned inward to immortalize its soul before its body was taken again. Michael the Ava's successors inherited both his city and his curse. The Palaiologoi ruled an empire perpetually on the brink, beset by enemies, strangled by debt, kept alive by diplomacy and hope. They married their daughters to Serbian and Bulgarian princes, begged for aid from Rome, and fought among themselves. Each emperor inherited less than the last. The silver grew dull, the ceremonies thinner, the walls older, and yet the sense of destiny remained unbroken. In the 14th century, when the Ottoman Turks crossed into Europe, the Byzantines watched from their ramparts and prayed. They saw in the Turks echoes of every enemy they had ever faced: Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, Crusaders. Each had come promising the end of Rome, and each had failed. Perhaps, they told themselves, this too would pass. But it would not. By the 1400s, the empire was little more than the city itself and a few coastal towns. Yet even then its people refused despair. They maintained the schools, the rituals, the music. Hagia Sophia still held services every Sunday. Its choir sang the same hymns sung when Constantine himself had walked the earth. The candles still burned before the icons, fewer now but bright. To the west, scholars fleeing the shrinking empire carried Greek manuscripts into Italy. There, they found eager students, painters, poets, and thinkers who would one day call themselves Renaissance men. Plato, Aristotle, and Homer traveled westward in their hands, and through them, Byzantium's flame would be reborn in another world. In exile once more, the empire taught the world how to wake. For 2 centuries after 1261, the restored Byzantium lived as if under a spell, half memory, half miracle. The emperors walked among ruins and called them palaces. The people gazed across the Bosphorus at the rising towers of the Ottomans and said, "The Lord will not abandon his city." But God, it seemed, had gone silent. And yet, in that silence, the empire continued to pray, to write, to sing. The Byzantines had learned the art of survival beyond hope. They had mastered the mystery of living as ghosts who refused to vanish. When travelers approached Constantinople in those final centuries, they said the city looked both alive and dead at once, the light of its domes glowing faintly over waters that had seen too much. The streets smelled of incense and seaweed, of old stone and memory. The wind carried fragments of chant from Hagia Sophia, as if the building itself was praying for mercy. This was the empire in exile still, even within its own walls. A kingdom of remnants, of poets and priests, of crumbling glory and unbroken faith. The Latins had taken its treasures, the Turks its lands, but no one could take what Byzantium truly was: the memory of Rome made sacred, the belief that beauty could defy decay. It would fall again, yes, but not yet. For a few more centuries, the candle would flicker on, pale, trembling, eternal, in the city that had outlived the world around it. By the 15th century, the Byzantine Empire was no longer an empire, at least not in the way the world once understood the word. What had been a continent-spanning civilization had contracted to a single city, a shimmering island of domes and prayer adrift in a sea of enemies. Yet within its walls, time seemed to stand still. The sun still caught on the mosaics of Hagia Sophia each morning as it had for 1,000 years. The priests still chanted the same hymns, their voices trembling through incense-thick air, and the people still whispered the same hope their ancestors had whispered through plagues and fires and crusades: the Lord will not abandon his city. But the Lord, like the empire's allies, had grown silent. When Manuel II Palaiologos inherited the throne in 1391, he inherited little else. Constantinople was surrounded, encircled by the armies of the rising Ottoman Sultanate. Once, the Byzantines had been the shield of Christendom. Now, they were its hostage. The great walls still stood, triple lines of stone and towers, but beyond them stretched Ottoman lands on every side. Trade had withered, the army was gone, the treasury empty. And yet Manuel was no passive prisoner. He was a man of wit and learning, a poet and philosopher who believed words might succeed where swords had failed. When the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid I, called the Thunderbolt, demanded the emperor's personal attendance as a vassal, Manuel went, but as a diplomat, not a slave. He sat in the Sultan's court, studying his enemy, learning his customs, biding his time. Then fate intervened. In 1402, far to the east, another storm rose. Tamerlane, the Mongol conqueror whose empire stretched from India to the Caspian, swept westward. His armies met Bayezid's at Ankara, and in a single catastrophic battle, the Ottoman dream shattered. Bayezid was captured, his empire dissolved into chaos. For Byzantium, it was a breath, a reprieve from drowning. Manuel returned to Constantinople determined to rebuild what little he could. He repaired the walls, restored the harbor, reopened the schools, and knowing that faith alone would not save him, he journeyed across Europe seeking allies. He stood before kings and popes, before the courts of Paris and London, his robes threadbare from travel. He spoke of the ancient empire, the cradle of their own civilization, now besieged and gasping. The scholars listened, the nobles praised his eloquence. But when he asked for armies, they offered only prayers. Europe had changed. The West was no longer the child that once looked to Constantinople for wisdom. It had its own quarrels, its own ambitions. The new kingdoms of France and England were locked in war, the papacy was divided, and the merchants of Venice and Genoa cared more for trade than salvation. Manuel returned home with gifts and sympathy, but no soldiers. Still, he endured. He reigned for over 30 years, keeping the flicker alive through diplomacy, marriage alliances, and faith. When he died in 1425, his son John VIII Palaiologos took the crown, another emperor of a realm reduced to a memory. John was tall, dignified, and weary beyond his years. He ruled over a city of ghosts, narrow streets where grass grew between the stones, palaces half collapsed, entire districts abandoned to stray dogs and sea wind. The population had fallen to perhaps 50,000, barely enough to fill the hippodrome where their ancestors had once cheered emperors crowned in glory. Outside the walls, the new Ottoman Sultan Murad II watched patiently. He didn't need to storm the city. Time itself was doing the work for him. The Byzantines survived by tribute, diplomacy, and illusion. They spoke of their city as the center of the world. But the world had moved on. In his desperation, John VIII turned once more to the West. He knew that only a united Christendom could hope to resist the Ottoman tide. And so in 1438, he traveled to Italy to attend the Council of Florence, a meeting meant to heal the centuries-old rift between the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches. The emperor sailed across the sea, accompanied by scholars, bishops, and the greatest theologians of his age, among them George Gemistos Plethon, the philosopher who still taught Plato as if he had never died. When John arrived in Florence, he was greeted as a relic of antiquity, a living echo of Rome itself. The Italians admired his elegance, his jeweled robes, his quiet gravity. The council dragged on for months. The theologians argued endlessly over a single phrase, a single breath in a creed. The Byzantines held firm until one by one, hunger and exhaustion wore them down. The emperor's treasury could no longer feed his entourage. The pope promised aid, if only they would sign. In 1439, they did. The Union of Florence was proclaimed. In that moment, Rome and Constantinople were, on paper, one church again. Bells rang across Italy. Paintings were commissioned. Choirs sang. But when the emperor returned home, the people greeted him not as a savior, but as a traitor. They refused to accept the Union. To them, the Latin Church was still the enemy that had plundered their city in 1204. Better the Sultan's turban than the Pope's tiara, one monk wrote bitterly. The emperor's plea for unity was met with silence. The aid Rome promised never came, and the shadow that had waited beyond the walls began to move again. In 1451, Mehmed II became Sultan. He was only 19, brilliant, restless, and bound by a destiny larger than himself. Where others saw an ancient, crumbling city, he saw the jewel his ancestors had failed to claim. There is only one empire under heaven, he told his advisors, and I will be its Caesar. The Ottomans called him Fatih, the conqueror. He began preparations at once. Fortresses were built on both sides of the Bosphorus, sealing the city from the sea. Cannons were cast of bronze so massive that oxen strained to move them. One, the great basilica cannon, could hurl stone balls heavier than a man. Its roar would soon be heard across the centuries. Inside the city, Emperor Constantine the Père Enfant Palaiologos, the last of his line, took the throne. He was a man of courage and melancholy, a soldier king ruling a graveyard. He had no illusions left. He knew the walls could not hold forever, yet he refused to flee. Better to die as emperor, he said, than live as a slave. By spring of 1453, the Ottoman army encircled Constantinople, more than 100,000 strong, while within the city fewer than 10,000 men stood to defend it, including a few thousand foreign volunteers led by the Genoese captain Giovanni Giustiniani. The siege began on April 6th. Day and night the cannons thundered, the ground shook, the walls trembled. Each dawn the Byzantines repaired by hand what had fallen in the night. Women carried stones, priests carried icons along the ramparts. When shells tore through the towers, the defenders sang hymns louder than the guns. Inside Hagia Sophia, services continued. The golden dome shone in candlelight, though the city around it burned. Mothers brought their children to the altar to be blessed, whispering prayers that their names would not be forgotten. The emperor rode through the streets in armor polished to silver, his face calm, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. He spoke to the soldiers not as a ruler, but as a brother. "We have come to the end," he told them. "Remember what you fight for, your faith, your homes, your city. And if God wills it, your name shall live as long as the stones of these walls." Each day brought another assault, another breach, another miracle of survival. For weeks, Constantinople stood as it had always stood, defiant, radiant, doomed. On the night of May 28th, The priests gathered the people in Hagia Sophia for one final liturgy. The church overflowed. Greeks, Genoese, Venetians, soldiers, beggars, all kneeling together for the first and last time. They confessed their sins, embraced, forgave one another. Even those who had once refused union now whispered Latin prayers beside their Orthodox neighbors. In the flickering light, faith and fear became one. Outside, the Ottomans prepared for the final assault. Mehmed rode among his soldiers, promising gold, freedom, and paradise. He carried a white banner, the sign of victory. At dawn, the horns sounded. The earth shook as the cannons opened fire one last time. The walls cracked, the gates splintered. Justinian fell wounded, and his men faltered. Through the breach surged the Janissaries, young men taken from Christian villages, now fighting beneath the crescent. Constantine fought in a melee, his sword red with dust and blood. Witnesses said he cried, "The city is lost, but not our souls." Then he vanished in the crush, his body never found. By noon, the city was gone. The Ottomans poured through the streets, looting, burning, crying victory. The sky darkened with smoke. The sea turned red along the shore. Hagia Sophia, refuge of the desperate, was broken open. The people inside were seized, the icons shattered, the altar overturned. Mehmed rode to the great doors, dismounted, and entered the church. He looked up at the dome, its gold still gleaming through soot, and whispered, "There is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet." Then he ordered the building preserved. Hagia Sophia would become a mosque, but its bones would remain. Even the conqueror knew he stood within something greater than conquest. Outside, the crescent banner rose above the walls. The empire that had called itself Rome for more than 1,000 years was no more. And yet, as the smoke drifted over the Bosphorus, a few Byzantine ships escaped, carrying monks, relics, and manuscripts. They sailed west, toward Italy, toward memory. In their cargo lay the writings of Plato and Aristotle, the Gospels in Greek, the philosophies that would ignite the Renaissance. In that sense, Byzantium did not die. It transformed. Its body fell, but its mind crossed the sea. Its art and wisdom would shape the modern world, even as its name faded into legend. When the sun set that evening, the domes of Constantinople glowed crimson beneath the smoke. The air smelled of ash and salt, of endings. Somewhere, a broken bell tolled once, then stopped. The empire of the Romans, born in glory, baptized in faith, buried in fire, had finally come to rest. But as long as the sea still touched the stones of the Bosphorus, as long as the candles still flickered in the churches of distant lands, the spirit of Byzantium endured, quiet, defiant, eternal. The city was gone. The light remained. When the smoke of conquest cleared from the Bosphorus, the world stood still. The queen of cities, which had once been the heart of Rome and the guardian of Christendom, lay silent. Its streets were filled with ash and broken marble. Its churches echoed with foreign prayers. The banners of Byzantium, those deep purple emblems of an empire that had outlasted 1,000 storms, were gone. And yet, in the stillness that followed, something remarkable happened. The city did not vanish. It changed its name, its language, its faith, but not its soul. Constantinople, now under the crescent, remained the axis of the world, its stones still whispering the memory of what had been. The conquerors themselves felt it. Mehmed II, who had taken the city by cannon and sword, walked its streets in awe. He ordered the mosaics of Hagia Sophia to be covered, not destroyed, its domes repaired, not razed. He summoned Greek scholars to his court, offered protection to artisans and physicians, and declared himself Kaiser Rom, Caesar of Rome. Even in victory, he sought legitimacy from the empire he had ended, because the truth was simple. Byzantium could be conquered, but never erased. For more than 1,000 years, the empire had endured plagues, schisms, invasions, and betrayals. It had seen the fall of Rome, the rise of Islam, the rage of crusaders, and the birth of nations. It had lived through every ending and found a way to begin again. That resilience did not vanish in 1453. It scattered like embers carried by the wind. Those embers would ignite fires across the world. When the last ships fled Constantinople, they carried more than survivors. They carried civilization. Aboard those galleys were monks and scholars bearing priceless manuscripts, Homer and Sophocles, Plato and Aristotle, Galen and Euclid, works that had been copied, preserved, and guarded through centuries of chaos now sailed toward Italy. In Florence, Venice, and Rome, these refugees found eager students, painters and poets, architects and thinkers gathered around them, learning the Greek tongue and rediscovering the forgotten wisdom of antiquity. The Renaissance, the rebirth of art and knowledge, was born from Byzantium's ashes. The humanists of Italy would call their movement new, but it was not new. It was ancient thought reborn through Byzantine hands. The domes of Florence echoed the geometry of Hagia Sophia. The frescoes of Raphael and Michelangelo carried the ghost of Byzantine mosaics, the gold, the solemn faces, the light that seemed to breathe from stone. Even the printing press, that miracle of the modern world, spread first the texts carried west from the fallen empire. And so, in dying, Byzantium became immortal. It gave the West its past, and through that past, its future. In the East, the faith of Byzantium endured in another form. The Patriarch of Constantinople, though stripped of empire, remained spiritual head of the Orthodox world. Under Ottoman rule, the Greeks, Serbs, Bulgarians, and Russians all looked to him as guardian of their faith. But it was in Russia that Byzantium found its most enduring heir. When the Grand Prince Ivan III of Moscow married Sophia Palaeologina, niece of the last Byzantine emperor, he adopted more than a bride. He adopted a destiny. The double-headed eagle of Byzantium became the emblem of Russia. The Kremlin rose with towers inspired by Constantinople's domes. Moscow proclaimed itself the third Rome, heir to the fallen second. 2 Romes have fallen, the monks wrote, but the third stands, and there will be no fourth. Through Orthodox liturgy, iconography, and theology, the soul of Byzantium flowed northward, frozen into Slavic hymns and candlelight. Every icon painted in Kiev or Novgorod bore the imprint of Constantinople's lost brilliance. Every church built beneath a rising onion dome was, in its own way, a continuation of the empire's prayer. Even under the Ottomans, the Greek community within the city endured. They called themselves the Rum Millet, the Roman nation, holding on to that word Roman long after the empire was gone. They kept their faith, their language, their liturgy. They sang the same hymns beneath Turkish skies, whispered the same prayers in secret when forbidden. For centuries, they told their children stories of the day the city would rise again, when angels would descend and the Emperor Constantine would awaken from stone to reclaim his throne. The city became myth, and myth became memory. Travelers from the west, arriving by sea, still marveled at its skyline, the same silhouette that had awed crusaders and merchants a millennium before. The domes, the towers, the glittering waters, they spoke of a past that refused to fade. One Venetian wrote, "It is as if the ghosts of Rome still walk its walls at night." He was not wrong. History books call 1453 an ending, but for Byzantium, endings were only transformations. In art, it became beauty refined by suffering. In faith, it became endurance. In politics, it became legend. Even today, its fingerprints remain everywhere. Every church that rings a bell, every mosaic that catches light, every scholar who quotes Aristotle, all trace their lineage to the empire that refused to forget. It was Byzantium that taught Europe how to balance faith with reason, empire with mercy, beauty with sorrow. It was Byzantium that kept alive the manuscripts that would build universities, the architecture that would inspire cathedrals, the melodies that would echo through centuries. Its influence flows quietly through the veins of the modern world like blood beneath skin, unseen but essential. And in a way, the empire achieved what it had always sought: immortality, not of power, but of meaning. Sometimes, history leaves behind a silence so complete it becomes music. The night of May 28, 1453, was such a silence. Chroniclers tell that when the final service ended in Hagia Sophia and the people wept beneath the golden dome, a strange light appeared above it, a glowing mist, soft and shimmering. It hovered there for hours, visible to both defenders and besiegers, before vanishing into the clouds. The Turks believed it was a sign from God that the city was theirs. The Greeks believed it was the Holy Spirit departing until the city would be pure again. Centuries later, fishermen on the Bosphorus still claim to see that light on certain nights, floating faintly above the skyline, a pale reflection of the empire's undying soul. The story of Byzantium is not simply a chronicle of kings and battles, it is a meditation on time itself. No empire in history lasted longer, nor fell more slowly, with such dignity. It survived because it learned what few civilizations ever do, that strength lies not only in conquest, but in continuity, that faith can outlast fortresses, that ideas are more enduring than crowns. Its people were flawed, often proud, often divided, but they believed that beauty was a form of prayer and knowledge a path to God. Their world may have perished, but their belief that light can survive in darkness remains. Imagine the city now, not as it fell, but as it was reborn in memory. The dawn breaks over the Bosphorus. The minarets rise beside ancient domes. The muezzin calls, and from hidden chapels beneath the modern city, candles flicker before old icons. The air smells of salt and incense, the same as it did in the days of Constantine. The water glimmers gold. Somewhere beneath the streets lies the foundation of the Augustion, where emperors once stood to be crowned. Beneath that, Roman stones. Beneath those, Greek earth. Layer upon layer, century upon century, the city endures. The Byzantines used to say that God's light, once lit, can never be extinguished. They believed their empire had been chosen as its vessel. They were right, but not in the way they imagined. That light escaped their walls. It crossed oceans and generations. It shines now wherever wisdom is cherished, wherever art defies oblivion, wherever faith and beauty refuse to die. So when we speak of the fall of Constantinople, what we truly mean is its transformation. The empire ended, but its heartbeat moved elsewhere. In cathedrals that echo its domes, in philosophies that mirror its depth, in every soul that still looks eastward at dawn and feels something ancient stirring in the light. The Ottomans built their mosques from its stones, the Renaissance built its brilliance from its books, the modern world built its memory from its myth. Byzantium, in dying, gave birth to all that followed, and perhaps that was its truest destiny. For even as the last emperor fell upon the walls, even as the cross was lowered from the dome of Hagia Sophia, the idea of Byzantium rose higher than any tower. It became not a nation, but a symbol of endurance through ruin, of grace through grief, of faith against finality. 1,000 years before, when the first emperor Constantine had dedicated his city, he had said, "In this sign we conquer." He could not have known that the conquest would not be of land or power, but of time itself. And so, as night falls once more over the Bosphorus, and the stars shimmer above the domes and minarets, the story continues. The empire sleeps, but its dream remains awake. The light that burned in the mosaics of Hagia Sophia, in the eyes of saints and emperors, in the hearts of a people who refuse to vanish, that light still burns, faint perhaps, but unending, the light that never died.